Tonight's topic is sages against prophets and priests. And so we are going into the tradition of ancient Israel, a little bit into the First Temple period, but primarily focusing on the Second Temple period and trying to look at defining these roles, the traditions that grew out of these roles that are in some ways a little independent of each other and also a little antagonistic to each other, but of course there's a lot of overlap as well, and evolution over time. So prophets, priests, and sages, while there of course is overlap, so some people who act as prophets are also priests, some priests are also scribes who are interested in wisdom literature, sages. Nevertheless, they also represent different ways of acting, different ways of representing authority. So for example, prophets speak in the name of the Lord. It's revelatory. They'll produce, it's called Vedic or prophetic poetry that commands action. So thus says the Lord, repent, that kind of thing. Priests are of course in charge of like the temple and rituals, and those rituals are rooted in divine law. So they hearken back to Moses and the law of Moses. So instead of producing poetry where they're speaking directly for the Lord, they are instead attempting to ground their tradition and their law, their observances in history, and they do this by producing the laws and writing, essentially creating mythic histories, as we'll see. So sages are maybe a little less known, but there is another whole branch of the tradition, the biblical tradition, included in the Bible that relates to the divine wisdom. And the sages are also teachers whose focus, though, is not on Torah, but is instead on sayings, the kind of teachings, especially Proverbs, which are ethical maxims that you give, like a teacher gives to students or parents give to their children, maxims for how to live life without saying, thus says the Lord, or without saying, this came down from on high, this was the law given to us by Moses. Rather, these are the sayings of a wise sage, and often they hark back to the proverbially wisest sage of them all, King Solomon the Wise. So, priests and sages, scribes, are often officials of the rulers. So in the First Temple period, there are kings of Judah who have essentially made an alliance with the high priesthood and the other priests who are centered in Jerusalem. And part of the reform at the very end of that First Temple period is to centralize rule at Jerusalem and at the Jerusalem temple. And that obviously is a great source of authority for the Jerusalem priesthood, the Zadokites, and it actually puts the Levites out of a job. But by having that centralized in the capital with the king, that also gives the king more control directly over religious observance. In the same way, sages are largely drawn out of a scribal community, and there are scribes who are priests, but there are also scribes who are directly working for the government and have a largely governmental role, and so they are also officials of the king. Meanwhile, prophets, while they could be a royal advisor and could have some kind of a job there at court, prophets just as often in the biblical literature stand outside of royal patronage or the patronage of the rulers. So later, the rulers of Jerusalem are governors that are appointed either by the Persian emperor or by the Hellenistic kings that are in charge of the province. And so prophets often considered it their role to challenge the ruler, and also sometimes to challenge the ruler's priests and the ruler's sages. That said, prophets and priests sometimes made a common cause, what we might think of as more of a religious cause, although the separation between religion and non-religion was which is much more pronounced now as we have this idea of the secular space and the religious space, whereas all more holistic in the past. Nevertheless, the prophets and priests, for which there's a bunch of overlap, so for example, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, who were prophets, they're also both priests, they often saw their traditions allied against the very different kind of authority espoused by the sages, who are often appealing to human wisdom, or wisdom that could be kind of grasped by reason. There's also ultimately God is the source of wisdom, but you don't need a prophetic voice or divine law carved in stone down from Sinai in order to get it. This is something that a wise sage can formulate. So let's just look at this, how these traditions operate in kind of a thumbnail. So priestly writing, like I say, attributes authority to law, to Torah. So for example, law is Torah and Torah are the same as written in the Torah, like the book of Deuteronomy, which was a part of it, which is then placed into the past, and so it has a precedent. It's supposedly grounded in history, although the history is mythic. The character of Moses is, there may have been a historical Moses. I think it's fairly unlikely, but nevertheless, what we have of him is all way written down so much later that this is not, that this is a later writing that doesn't describe that, a historical figure. But we read in Deuteronomy, "These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan." So the setting here is at the very end of the Exodus story. Moses is giving the law to the Israelites as he is about to wander off into the desert, and the Israelites are going to be led by Joshua into the land. We read that this is in the 40th year on the first day of the 11th month, so it's trying to be grounded in a sort of history. Moses spoke to the Israelites just as the Lord had commanded him to speak to them, and then the author here puts in quasi-historical details to ground it. This was after Moses had defeated King Sihon of the Amorites, who had reigned in Heshbon, and King Og of Bashan, who reigned in Ashtaroth in Edrei. Beyond the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this law as follows. And so with that grounding, then law, then it becomes the whole focus, and rules and so on are the whole focus of the priestly writing, for example, as expressed in the book of Deuteronomy. By contrast, prophetic texts, which were usually written as poetry, attribute their authority to sort of a direct revelatory, visionary calling from God, and then the capacity or the calling to speak the divine word as though God were speaking through the prophet's mouth. So we hear this, for example, famously in Isaiah's description of his calling. Isaiah says, "I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him, each had 6 wings. With two they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory.' And Isaiah said, 'Woe is me, I am lost,' as he's having this vision of the throne of God For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar. Holding it with a pair of tongs, the seraph touched my mouth with it and said, "Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out." And then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" And I said, "Here am I, send me." So this is a visionary calling, direct revelation. Isaiah is experiencing a vision of the throne of God and is now going to continue that as a source of authority to speak on God's behalf, daring essentially to speak his words as if they're the words of the Lord. So in doing this, prophets are not relying on quoting, for example, Torah for their authority. We haven't seen this grounded in this happened in this such a time and Moses said this, and then they write the utterings as though that were part of history. Rather, it's as though they're speaking for God. So meanwhile, although the sages in their texts picture wisdom, holy wisdom, as a divine being and cite her as the first of God's creations, they tend to attribute their writings to sayings of wise human teachers like the legendary Solomon. And these teachings generally have very practical purposes in mind. So we read at the very beginning of the book of Proverbs, the sort of title and superscript, "The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for learning about wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for gaining instruction in wise dealing, righteousness, justice, and equity, to teach shrewdness to the simple, knowledge and prudence to the young. Let the wise too hear and gain in learning, and the discerning acquires skill, to understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles." So there's all of these practical reasons that you're going to want that different peoples of different education levels are going to want to be exposed to these many proverbs that are included in this collection. So the sages present their teachings, like I say, not as divine law, inherited from Moses, the way the priests do, or as the divine word spoken by revelation, like the prophets do, but rather as sensible teachings like those of a parent instructing children. So Proverbs here goes on saying, "Hear, my children, your father's instruction, and do not reject your mother's teaching, for they are a fair garland for your head and pendants for your neck." So these traditions, like I say, are often in a little bit of conflict. And so, for example, the prophet Isaiah, who we just read his conversion vision, or his calling vision, he was active around the time of the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel, although the book itself was then expanded and added to for centuries thereafter. His work was later venerated by a prophetic school that kept that alive and kept adding to it into the Second Temple period. Isaiah, though, the earlier Isaiah, is dubious of both the ritual observances of the priests and also the maxims of the sages, as illustrated in this Vedic poem, which is found in Isaiah chapter 29. So Isaiah says, "The Lord said, because these people draw near with their mouths and honor me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me, and their worship of me is a human commandment learned by rote, so I will again do amazing things with this people, shocking and amazing. The wisdom of their wise shall perish, and the discernment of the discerning shall be hidden." So As we saw here again, just to point it out, Isaiah and others in the prophetic tradition are claiming to speak with the Lord's voice. So the first thing Isaiah says is, "The Lord said," and then it's all a quotation, theoretically. And here and elsewhere, he is dubious of rote ritual worship performed by the priests. So this is a human commandment, he's saying. But he also predicts doom for the sages and their wisdom. The wisdom of the wise shall perish. The prophet Jeremiah, operating at the very end of the First Temple period, around the time that Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians, he was also very active in court politics in Jerusalem, and he identified rivals among all of these groups. So he is noting the problems with the wise, the sages, other priests. So Jeremiah was from a different priestly line than the Zadokites of Jerusalem. So he's not part of the in-group that the high priest is, but is still from a different priestly line that traces its lineage to Shiloh. And he also doesn't get along with other prophets. So he records in his book in chapter 18, "Then they," all of these enemies, said, "Come, let us make plots against Jeremiah, for instruction shall not perish from the priest, nor counsel from the wise, nor the word from the prophet." So here we have all those three groups, the priest, the wise, the sage, in other words, and the prophet. "Come, let us bring charges against him." Let's trump up charges against Jeremiah so that we can get rid of him, and let us not heed any of his words. In one of Jeremiah's kind of Vedic poems, he charges that the scribes have made the Torah of the Lord into a lie. We read, "You shall say to them, 'Thus says the Lord.'" So it calls upon, invokes the Lord's name and speaks for the Lord as a prophet. "When people fall, do they not get up again? If they go astray, do they not turn back? Why then has this people turned away in perpetual faithlessness? How can you say, 'We are wise, and the Torah of the Lord is with us, the law of the Lord is with us,' when in fact the false pen of the scribes has made it into a lie?" So he continues predicting the ruin of the wise the same way that Isaiah had, but along with all the other priests and prophets other than himself. So Jeremiah says here, "The wise shall be put to shame. They shall be dismayed and taken, since they have rejected the word of the Lord," spoken through the prophets here. "What wisdom is in them? Therefore I will give their wives to others and their fields to conquerors, because from the least to the greatest, everyone is greedy for unjust gain. From prophet to priest, everyone deals falsely." So Jeremiah is not a fan of any prophets or priests or sages other than himself. So meanwhile, although the hero of the sages, King Solomon, has a place in the Deuteronomic histories, which are associated with priestly schools, where although they acknowledge his wisdom, for example, here this painting is, the famous mythic judgment, where the two women are trying to argue whose baby is theirs, the one baby that has died and the other that is still alive, and Solomon is going to split the baby, but the mother whose child it actually is gives it so that it won't die, that kind of a thing. So that wisdom is in the portrayal, but that portrayal is also undercut in the Book of Kings because of a lack of legitimacy in Solomon's succession. So Solomon is a younger son of David, and he is a son of David by Bathsheba, a favorite of David's, but a favorite whom David married in great wrongdoing by having had her husband, who was a loyal officer of David's, killed, and while David was having an adulterous affair with her, and then she later marries him and later gives birth as a second child to Solomon, as a second child to David from Bathsheba. And then when Solomon actually takes the throne, he has a little bit of a bloodbath where he consolidates his power, killing off some of his brothers and some of David's most loyal officers who were not loyal to Solomon. So in other words, there's a lack of besmirching his succession, and also in the book of Kings, Solomon is portrayed as falling into idolatry in his old age. So we've seen before how when you have negative stories like this, it may be to undermine the sort of the reputation and credibility of an opponent group's, sort of the person that they are drawing authority from. And so the sages look to Solomon, and now the priests are writing all of these negative stories about Solomon. So for example, in the account in the book of Kings, 1 Kings, despite his wisdom, Solomon falls into error in his old age. So we read, King Solomon loved many foreign women along with the daughter of Pharaoh. There were also Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women from the nations concerning which the Lord has said to the Israelites, "You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for they will surely incline your heart to follow their gods." So this is, again, the priestly stories, the Deuteronomic histories are concerned often with law and the right behavior. And we saw, for example, when we looked at our lecture where we were looking at Ezra and Ruth, how Ezra, the kind of chief priest who was possibly the scribe who brought the Torah together, in his rule, along with Nehemiah in Jerusalem, was especially concerned with separating out the returning Judeans from any intermarriages that they had, especially Moabite wives. And so that was a major program. And so here, Solomon has actually broken that very same commandment. And the results of this is that Solomon clung to these wives and concubines in love, and his wives turned away his heart. For Solomon followed Astarte, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. So he puts up foreign shrines to the pagan gods. He did the same for all of his foreign wives who offered incense and sacrificed to their gods. And then the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel. So, as described here in the Deuteronomic histories that are written by the priests, the actions of Solomon don't seem very wise, especially into his old age. So, by contrast, the sages also fought back and condemned some of the things that the priests are interested in. So the priests might have you believe that giving a very expensive sacrifice, a ritual sacrifice at the temple, for which you're going to have to be paying a premium to the priests in charge of the temple, the priests might tell you that will allow you to atone for your sins. But not so, says the sages in the book of Proverbs. So we read in the book of Proverbs, the sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord, but the prayer of the upright is his delight. So it doesn't matter if you're going to do these purification and sacrificial rituals that the priests are offering. What you really need is the wisdom and Proverbs of the sages. In Proverbs, holy wisdom, the embodiment of wisdom, declares, "And now, my children, listen to me. Happy are those who keep my ways. Hear instruction and be wise, and do not neglect it. For whoever finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord. So the way to obtain the Lord's favor is not by doing rote priestly rituals, but rather is by listening to the instruction of wisdom. That's how you will gain true favor with the Lord. So, who are the wise? Who are these sages? What is their wisdom that both the prophets and the priests apparently found threatening enough to pause from attacking each other in order to make common cause, in order to denounce sages and their wisdom? So, we've said a million times that although Christians today read the Bible very frequently as though it were speaking with just one voice, and this especially happens if you are always approaching the Bible in English in the King James Version, because it already has this kind of old-timey Shakespeare-y soundy feel, so it sounds like it's all written with one voice. That's just the translation. And they understand it to, for example, not contradict itself. The reality is that the Bible is a library of many books that speak in different voices, and these voices actually are often in direct conflict. So, for example, the prophetic tradition is often very much in conflict with the wisdom tradition. The prophet Amos assures us, quote, "The Lord God does nothing without revealing his secret to his servants." And who are his servants, according to the prophetic tradition? The prophets. So God doesn't do anything without revealing his secret to his servants. But the sage who wrote Ecclesiastes, as we heard, we did a whole lecture on Ecclesiastes just a couple months ago, is dubious that God's most important mysteries can ever be known. So Ecclesiastes, the teacher, says, God has put a sense of the past and the future into their minds, into the minds of humans. Yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. Who knows, even, whether the human spirit goes upwards and the spirit of animals goes downward to the earth? We can't even know about afterlife. That's nothing that is knowable to us. So, like I say, although many people misunderstand the Bible as a history book, there is historical information in the Bible, but it is not a history book. It's also not a science book, certainly. It's not written with one voice, and it's not internally consistent. It's a library of religious books, rather than history or science books. It speaks in many voices, and in fact, the different voices are often contradicting each other because of their alternating perspectives, both the competing traditions that we've already just outlined, but also even within the traditions that we saw. Jeremiah also attacks, he's a priest and a prophet, but he attacks other priests and other prophets. So you can just see kind of the whole vast library of the different scrolls that make up the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, as well as the Christian New Testament. And of these, within the Old Testament, and this is the broader Old Testament as the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, and from antiquity, that is the canon for Catholic and Orthodox Church, as opposed to Protestant and Jewish canon. Of those, a set of these are the wisdom and tradition, which includes the Psalms. In the category, anyway, it's wisdom and Psalms, but we're not going to look at the Psalms today. We're just going to look at the wisdom books. And so, leaving the Psalms aside, there are 3 books representing the wisdom tradition in the Hebrew Bible, or the Protestant Old Testament, and those are the books of Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. And in addition to this, in the Septuagint, what the Protestants consider Apocrypha, what Catholics and Orthodox call the deuterocanonical components of the Bible, they're the additional texts of Sirach, and a book that's alternatively called, Sirach is sometimes called Ecclesiasticus, and the other book, Wisdom of Solomon, is also called the Book of Wisdom. Of these, Proverbs includes sections that date to the First Temple period, in other words, before the destruction of Solomon's temple and the Babylonian exile. But the other texts date entirely from the Second Temple period, and Proverbs also has components that are Second Temple period components. Of these 5, only the authorship of the book of Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus, is known. So this was written by a Jewish sage writing around the year 180 before the Common Era in Egypt, a sage named Jesus ben Sirach. Job is an anonymous text, so it's not actually meant to be written by a character named Job. It is an anonymous text about a character named Job. And the book of wisdom, although it's often called, and I'm writing it here, Wisdom of Solomon, it's actually an anonymous text, and it doesn't claim anywhere inside it to be written by Solomon, but it has that attribution sometimes that's put on top of it. Both Proverbs and Ecclesiastes do claim to be written by Solomon, but both of the books were written long after, or the claims that are being made within the books, the components of the books, those were made long after the legendary king's time would have been, his place in history. So these are not written by Solomon. We've looked before in many lectures on David and Solomon about why, if there were historical figures named David and Solomon, that is what we have about them. All of the stories about them in the Bible are much later and are mythic as opposed to historic stories about these figures. So Jerusalem itself only rose in power after the fall of the much richer and more populous northern Amorite kingdom of Israel. And so in the process that it was rising in power, Jerusalem's kings, because they were known as the house of David, people reasoned that they had an eponymous, in other words, an ancestor that had that name, David, who was at the head of their line. But as often the case with the eponymous ancestor of a royal house, you don't really know much about that figure, just that you're known as being from the house of that figure. Biblical sagas, then, were composed to tell stories about that founder, potentially because of royal patronage. The kings wanted to hear stories about their mythic ancestor. And this included the myth that Judah had once ruled the northern kingdom of Israel from the capital, Jerusalem. But archaeologically, that doesn't make any sense, since at that time, Jerusalem was just a very tiny center of the very sparsely populated region of the southern realms. So what's really more likely happening is the northern kingdom is the center, and Judah is a poor neighbor at that time. So in the same way that the name David was associated with the royal house and also with the city of Jerusalem, which is also called the city of David, the first temple seems to have been associated with Solomon, including, for example, we read about all of those idols that Solomon sets up in the Deuteronomic history in the book of Kings. So those we read also in those texts, later texts, 2 Kings, were present at the time when some of the last kings, Hezekiah and Josiah, actual historic kings, when they were busily destroying idols and working on centralization and monolatry, worshiping Yahweh only. So because of the association of the temple with the name Solomon, that also may have inspired the myths associated with Solomon in the Bible. So this sort of speculation on what the origin of those stories, another possibility is that these are, again, courtly stories, and the reason why there's all of these negative stories about Solomon is because writers at the time of King Josiah are writing about kind of courtly intrigue of an immediate predecessor of Josiah, King Manasseh, who also is known for expanding paganism and having all of these concubines and things like that, the way Solomon is described. So they could be referring to and criticizing that character. So let's look now at the book of Proverbs. So like I say, it claims to be written by Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. However, it's clear that the text is not written by any one person, but is actually an anthology of Proverbs. And actually, scholars today identify it as a compilation of anthologies. So many people had been making collections of Proverbs over the centuries, and you take a bunch of different collections and they are gathered together to make one single collection. The first part and some of the other parts claim Solomon, but the first part is claiming Solomon is among the most recent sections that were written. So in other words, the last part that was added to this collection. So if we unroll the scroll and we look at the 31 chapters as we now have it in the present form of the book of Proverbs, the first sort of section is a set of Proverbs attributed to Solomon, first 7 chapters, which continues with that poem about wisdom personified, wisdom as the first of the creations of the Lord, and talking about her instruction to her children. Then 10 through 22 is a set of Proverbs that are again attributed to Solomon. Then there's another set of Proverbs that are called wise sayings, additional wise sayings. And then there is an additional set of Solomon's Proverbs, it says, that were gathered by Hezekiah's men. So that time period, like I'm saying, at the very end of the first temple period. And then added to this at the end are 2 very different late texts, the words of Augur and teachings attributed to a character named Lemuel's mother. So in other words, totally different components. So in its current form, the book of Proverbs has these very obvious themes, but even so, within these collections, there are earlier compilations of Proverbs that have been joined together. And for example, if we take that very middle part there that I have in yellow, chapters 22 through 24, the half of 24, this section entitled Words of the Wise, it turns out, is actually a reworking of a very popular and much more ancient Egyptian wisdom text written maybe at the Ramessid period in the 2nd millennium before the Common Era. So it's interesting that an Egyptian text that has nothing to do with ancient Israel could have a set of popular wisdom that was transferable, with some translation, of course, into the Jewish wisdom, illustrates the way the wisdom tradition is relatively maybe more cosmopolitan in nature than, for example, prophetic writings or Torah, the histories and the law. So as we're looking at the wisdom tradition, we should ask, what are Proverbs? And so a proverb is a short, pithy saying that encapsulates a general truth or piece of advice. So the fact that they're short and pithy or witty, that makes them easy to remember, and that's important in a society that relies largely on oral learning. So whereas the compilations here are kept by scribes and sages who are literate, the overwhelming majority of the population is not literate, and they are learning through memorization of word of mouth. So there's also very little evidence for any organized schools at all in the first temple period and even the early second temple period. And so the setting of most of the Proverbs is actually a parent teaching a child, a dad teaching his son or something like that, or it's sometimes a sage, a teacher that is offering instruction to a student in loco parentis in place of the parent, so taking that role. But the parent-child role is sort of central, which is how teaching is probably operated mostly at this time. So like I say, in general, Proverbs do not quote Mosaic law. It's not talking about the Torah or claiming to speak the word of God directly as prophets do. For the most part, the wisdom that's encapsulated in the book of Proverbs is what we could call prudential wisdom, so acting prudently. They're advising you that prudence, which is to say taking virtuous actions rather than vicious actions, is the path to success. And so here's just a couple examples. Proverbs goes on and on and on with different sayings, different proverbs. So we read, "A slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich." So if you're lazy, you're going to be poor. If you work hard, you're going to get rich. "Whatever walks in integrity walks securely, but whoever follows perverse ways will be found out." So if you are always on the up and up, nobody's ever going, you're secure in knowing that. But if you are doing things that are wrong, wrong will come out eventually. So people will learn that. "Hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all offenses." So the reaction to your different mindset. "A gossip goes about telling secrets, but one who is trustworthy in spirit keeps confidence." That's just a general lore, right? That seems like a simple truism. "Those who are kind reward themselves, but the cruel do themselves harm." So you're your own worst enemy. "Fools think that their own way is right, but the wise listen to advice." And this is my favorite universal truth from Proverbs. This is one I actually quote. "Even fools who keep silent are considered wise when they close their lips." I'm missing the last part of that. Okay, so they're deemed wise when they close their lips. Whereas if they open their mouths and actually talk, then they're understood to be fools. So, if you keep your mouth shut, no one's going to know that you're a fool, is the idea of that one. And there's just timeless truths. So wisdom is a fountain of life to one who has it, but folly is the punishment of fools. One who forgives an affront fosters friendship, but one who dwells on disputes will alienate a friend. So these again are not, this is pretty simplistic stuff. It's not so deep, right? I think that this one speaks to the issues that we have with contemporary disinformation, addiction, and conspiracy theories. It's better to meet a she-bear robbed of its cubs than to confront a fool immersed in folly. It's not easy to try to argue people out of their conspiracy theories. Okay, so of course, because the text is a compilation of sayings composed over centuries, advice given in one part of the anthology and one part of the book of Proverbs is actually very often contradicted elsewhere. So for example, although we are told that the wicked accept a concealed bribe in order to pervert the ways of justice, on the other hand, we are also given the practical advice to the contrary. A gift in secret averts anger, and a concealed bribe averts strong wrath. So wicked people are perverting justice by bribing, but on the other hand, if you bribe somebody, that could actually make somebody who's mad at you not, if you bribe somebody in secret, it could make the person who's mad at you relent. Similarly, many of the Proverbs extol wealth as a natural reward for behaving wisely and is also a bulwark. So you're always going to be, if you've collected a lot of wealth, you'll have a safety net. And so we read in chapter 10, verse 15, the wealth of the rich is their fortress. The poverty of the poor is their ruin. But despite the fact that there's a bunch of those, elsewhere we are cautioned that wealth is actually not as dependable as you might think. It's not always a fortress for the rich. So do not wear yourself out to get rich. Be wise enough to desist. When your eyes light upon it, when your eyes light upon wealth, it is gone, for it suddenly takes wing to itself, flying like an eagle towards heaven. So, you could easy come, easy go. You can't count on riches. So sometimes the contradictory advice even comes in back-to-back verses. So in chapter 26, verses 4 and 5, we read, "Do not answer fools according to their folly, lest you be a fool yourself." But then we also have to hear, "Answer fools according to their folly, lest they be wise in their own eyes." So, if, this is your, are you supposed to answer fools according to their folly, or you're not supposed to? In both cases, you're given contradictory things that you're told to do, but each one of them has their own practical consequence. So look, while there are tortured apologetic arguments that attempt to explain away contradictions, so there's this false premise, like I say, that the Bible does not contradict itself. The actual answer is the Bible contains multiple competing views from different authors that are in opposition to each other, and as a result, they do directly contradict each other. And that's just part of it, and we can just understand that and as a richer understanding of the text as a library. So in addition to containing, like I say, contradictory advice, there are also very obvious limits of the kind of prudential wisdom, act prudently and you'll do well, that we find in the book of Proverbs. So whereas acting prudently actually, may be more likely to generate positive results in your life, it's not a guarantee. You can do everything right and wisely and all the way up. And then there are times when that isn't going to prevent you from having misfortune. At least that's the way it is in real life. You will not hear that teaching that I just said in the book of Proverbs, because in the Proverbs instead you will always be reassured. Be assured, we read in chapter 11, verse 21, "The wicked will not go unpunished, but those who are righteous will escape punishment." Oh, and the next one, "If the righteous are repaid on earth, if they are rewarded on earth, how much more the wicked and the sinner will be punished for what they do. A false witness will not go unpunished, and a liar will not escape. And those who keep the commandment will live, those who are heedless of their ways will die." So if you are following all of these precepts, these maxims, you will live, and if you were a heedless fool, you're going to, find death. The problem with all of these are not a guarantee, because we all know from lived experience that these promises and hundreds of others in the book of Proverbs are not universally true. The wicked, very much in our own experience, as we observe, do go unpunished. Many live very long lives and are wealthy and seem to have all kinds of power. They, in some cases, seem to be happy. And simultaneously, people who are righteous and are doing all of the things according to prudential wise wisdom, they're not all rewarded. Some are going to die young to no fault of their own, just a genetic disease or a kind of random cancer that has nothing to do with their actions. And of course, things like liars get away with lying all the time, and so on and so on. There are limitations of the kind of prudential wisdom we find in Proverbs. And so that caused, as the tradition matured, as the tradition went on over the centuries, this caused later sages to reflect further. They're reading all these things, they know all of these maxims, they know all these proverbs, and yet they observe that the consequences are not always what the wisdom teaches. The result is a much more complex and sophisticated tradition, in this next layer of tradition called reflective wisdom. And this is the kind of wisdom that we find in the books of Ecclesiastes and the book of Job. So the authors of both of these texts, they're still committed to this wisdom tradition, and they're maybe not directly dependent on Proverbs, but they're aware of the kinds of teaching that is found in Proverbs, and they're conscious of that limitations of prudential wisdom. So we had a whole lecture very recently on Ecclesiastes that I invite you to go back to, but even though the book of Ecclesiastes, this next tier of wisdom writer, this next sage, is very committed to the tradition, he nevertheless has concluded, because of these limitations, that all mortal pursuits amount to vanity. So a central thesis of the text is vanity of vanities, says the teacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What do people gain from all the toil at which they toil under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. So the underlying Hebrew word hebel here, translated as vanity, that's repeated 37 times in the text. And so it literally means vapor and breath, but it figuratively can mean, everything's insubstantial, everything's vain, futile, meaningless. All is vanity can equate to everything is meaningless. And so prudential wisdom has been deconstructed, and the teacher, the author of Ecclesiastes, is trying to rebuild from that point. So the teacher's introductory lament continues by arguing that all mortal creation is going to be meaningless repetition. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There's nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing which is said, see, that's new? That's already been in the ages before us. And people continue to share that lament today, that if we come up with some idea, it turns out somebody's already done that before. So unlike Proverbs, which assures us that prudence yields success, the teacher, the author of Ecclesiastes, is aware that that's not always true. So he writes, "Again, I saw that under the sun, the race doesn't go to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to the skillful, but time and chance happen to them all. For no one can anticipate one's time. Like fish taken in a cruel net, or birds caught in a snare, so mortals are snared at a time of calamity when it suddenly falls upon them." So the reality is, no matter who you are, no matter how much you prepared, stuff happens in life. And it's not simply the cause of a reward or punishment based on you doing what is wise or not, but chance is part of it. And then also the reality is that you have to go through and live life, and you have a normal life cycle that is going to have an end. So again, unlike the sages of the book of Proverbs, who assure us that the wicked are always punished, the teacher, the author of Ecclesiastes, is aware that the wicked often go unpunished. So he says, "Moreover, I saw under the sun, in the place of justice, wickedness was there. And in the place of righteousness, wickedness was there as well." So wickedness exists in both kind of contexts. You're not only one is receiving justice. Some apocalyptic prophets in the later Second Temple period had begun to suggest that the wicked will be judged by God when the world soon ends, and that is when they will receive their punishment in an afterlife. So maybe that's what's going to happen. We obviously are seeing that good people, the righteous, are made to suffer in this life, but maybe they'll all have punishment in an afterlife. The teacher definitely agrees that God is the judge of all, but nevertheless he is quite skeptical that there will be punishment in an afterlife, or indeed that there will be an afterlife at all. So he writes, I said to myself, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for he has appointed a time for every matter and for every work. I said to myself with regard to humans, that God is testing them to show that they are but animals. For the fate of humans and of animals is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and humans have no advantage over the animals, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and all turn to dust again. Who knows whether the human spirit goes upward and the spirit of animals go downward to the earth? So, given that everyone just returns to dust, there's no reason to believe in an afterlife, I saw that there is nothing better than that all should enjoy their work, for that is their lot. For who can bring them to see what will be after them? So, for the teacher here in this tier of the wisdom tradition, the idea that humans may have an eternal spirit that ascends to heaven is unknowable, and so therefore, for him it is a vanity to even speculate about it. The teacher advises instead that we should be happy in our work, which is our lot, and the rest is unforeseeable. So sometimes people have said, well, maybe the Ecclesiastes here is actually promoting a kind of hedonism. In other words, we only focus on eat and drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. However, the teacher here claims to have tested the limits of hedonism. Claims here that he's King Solomon, and so he had all of these concubines, the delights of flesh, many concubines, but also that he had built great works like the temple. But in the end, he determined that it was all vanity and chasing after the wind, all of these sorts of pleasures that you might get. So he counsels instead simple joys and the benefits, for example, of having a good friend or two, and also, he says, enjoy life with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life that you're given under the sun, because that's the portion, your portion in life, and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. So it's actually more like, instead of just seek after sort of extreme hedonistic pleasures, take pleasure in all of the little things like companionship and friendship and basic work and that sort of thing. So alongside this reflective wisdom, there's a similarly sophisticated reflective wisdom found at the heart of the book of Job. So unlike the other books of the wisdom tradition that are primarily made up of Proverbs, in the case of, for example, Proverbs, or other longer teachings like Ecclesiastes, Job doesn't do that, and instead takes the form of a narrative with long internal dialogues. Job then is like an extended parable or a thought experiment, philosophical thought experiment, that asks the question, why would a completely innocent man ever be made to suffer just horrible losses? Why would God ever allow that sort of thing to happen? So just like as we saw with Proverbs, which is a collection of different texts, and we've talked about with the synoptic problem with the Gospels, we've talked about it with the Torah, with the different hypotheses of how the Torah was written over time. The book of Job, as we have it today, has also been subject to significant editing and adding on accumulation. So obvious seams in the text today kind of indicate where whole sections of the text have been added to the original. So the text as it is right now, we have written in prose text, a kind of a prologue that begins the story. Then the whole bulk of the text switches to poetry, beginning with an opening monologue by Job. Then we have 3 cycles of dialogues thinking about the problem of suffering and the problem of evil between Job and his three main friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Then there's this poem of wisdom. And then we have Job's closing monologue. After that, there's a fourth friend who shows up and gives a bunch of speeches. And then God speaks to Job. God appears and speaks to Job from the whirlwind. And then we go back out of poetry into prose again, and we have a very brief epilogue at the end. And so, just as in Proverbs, where the beginning part and then the stuff tacked on the end is probably the most recent parts of the text to have been written, the newest sections of Job are also the beginning and the end, this prose prologue and epilogue. And this is the text that frames the whole story as a wager between God and between Satan, and adds at the end kind of what we call maybe a happy ending. And then also, the next newest part is the God's speech from the whirlwind, very famous section of the text, but also a later addition to it. So each of these sections, the prose section and the God speaking out of the whirlwind, actually have a different worldview, a different answer to the problem of evil than does the core text, the earlier text. So, for example, if we go and just look at the framing of the story as established in the prologue and epilogue, this says that Job is set in the marital land of Uz. So Job is a non-Israelite. He's living in the land of Uz, which is probably Arabia. He's said to be blameless and upright and devoted to God. He possesses great wealth, 7 sons, 3 daughters, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, many, many servants, and he's called the greatest of all the people of the East. And in addition to performing the religious observances that he is obliged to do under the law, he also performs extra ones for all of his children, just to make sure that they are not doing the obligations. So in the prose prologue, we then switch to the heavenly court as the setting, and a courtier, one of the sons of God, the accuser, the Satan, comes before Yahweh, along with all of the other members of the divine court. So the accuser here is not, even though we have the word the Satan, is not the incarnation of evil, the cosmic devil that is later evolves in Second Temple Judaism, probably because of ideas imported from Zoroastrianism that's alive and well by the time we get to the time of Jesus and the origins of Christianity. In this case, the Satan serves Yahweh in the pantheon. So the accuser argues that the only reason that Job worships Yahweh, the only reason why he's so faithful, he's the most faithful of all of God's servants, is because God's been giving him all of those blessings, all those sons and daughters and wealth and so on. Yahweh's like, no, you're wrong, but he gives him over to Satan. He gives him to him, and he says, he is in your power in order to prove God's point to the accuser. The prose author actually now does a dodge, so he's not technically addressing the problem of evil. The divine wager instead reframes the text to try to illustrate that the truly wise people are going to act righteously, whether they're blessed or not in the short term, because his worldview, his argument actually is that the righteous will eventually be rewarded with long life and posterity. And that occurs in the prose ending that's tacked onto the end, where in the end, for example, after all of Job's children are killed in these calamities, he gets a whole new set of children. And I guess I would argue that you don't necessarily recover from the death of all of your children and everything like that just because you get new children at the end. So it's a little bit of a tacked on answer to the question. So what happens in the course of the prologue? Sabaean marauders, Chaldean soldiers, and a firestorm and a whirlwind kill all of Job's children and livestock. Job mourns, but he says, the Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So God's faith in Job is bearing out. But the accuser argues with God that this really wasn't a sufficient test, since even though Job lost all of his property and children, he retains his health. And so God replies, well, very well, he's in your power, only spare his life. And so Satan next inflicts loathsome sores on Job from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. At this point, Job's wife, who has suffered all of these losses, just looks to the guy and says, curse God and die. This is my best advice to you, Job. Just curse God and die. This is such a scandalous thing to have included in a text like this that later scribes altered the Hebrew so it reads, bless God and die, even though that doesn't really make a lot of sense. But in any event, this is a big rebuke. Answering his wife, though, Job says, you speak as any fool would speak. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad? So again, he is having this philosophical response to all of this suffering. He's doing all of the things that prudential wisdom would tell you to do. No matter how afflicted he is with all these terrible diseases, he continues to be perfectly pure and faithful and innocent. So as we mentioned, the prose epilogue was added by the same author as the prose prologue, so these first and last bits. And at the very end of the text, Job's three friends that are introduced in the main part of the text show up to explain, and also in the end, they explain that Job was right the whole time, and then also in the end, God explains that they have not spoken of me what is right, but my servant Job has. So after all of the debating has gone on, there's a happy ending here at the end that said that Job was right and these three were wrong. And in the end, like I say, Yahweh restores the fortunes of Job. So he gets 7 new sons, 3 new daughters, as well as restored health. And he's also given long life. So he gets to live to be 140 years old as a wealthy man. But like I say, a lot of people have pointed out you might still have some remorse for the first 7 sons and 3 daughters that were killed in these earlier calamities. So after those parts, which are the last parts, the next newest parts, also added to the original text, is that famous section, like I say, where God speaks to Job from the whirlwind, and that is in chapters 38 to 41. And then also an add-on is a much less remembered speech of Elihu, this kind of fourth friend of Job's that comes out of nowhere and has his own little speech in chapters 32 through 37. So both of these two segments roughly propose the same answer to the problem of evil, not the answer that is there in the prose section, which goes back to the prudential wisdom. Eventually you are going to be rewarded. These two have the cosmic answer. So they say essentially, you can't question God, because God's plans are too immense for mortals to see. You can't see why God is doing this. There's some important reason, and God is too big, and there's no way to question it. And the reason why both of these are likely to be inserted is that, again, Elihu's speech comes out of nowhere and has the same idea as the speech out of the whirlwind, but it's so much less dramatic and it's so much less good that it's very unlikely that anybody would have inserted that if the speech of the whirlwind already existed. So probably that was inserted first and then the whirlwind speech was inserted. So let's look at the whirlwind speech. In chapters 38 through 42, God answers Job and gives, like I say, a very memorable vision of God's cosmic infinite role in the Bible. Interrogates Job where he was. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Have the gates of death been revealed to you? Or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Can you draw out the Leviathan with a fishhook, or press down its tongue with a cord? Were not even the gods overwhelmed at the sight of it? Shall a fault finder like you contend with the Almighty? So, unlike, like I say, that prose, prologue, and epilogue, the author here proposes, that author who proposes that if the righteous are suffering, it's only temporary. It's perhaps a test, and that will be corrected. So that's the prose author's answer. The author of God's speech from the whirlwind, just like Elihu's speech, is that mortals inherently lack perspective to question why God allows the righteous to suffer. God is simply portrayed as cosmically powerful and beyond all moral comprehension and questioning. So, what we can kind of see by this text, as it's, if we go back now, as we peel it back to the original, is that it seems like 3 different editors were disturbed enough by the original text, and the original text is probably Job's opening monologue, the cycle of arguments, the dialogues that he has with his 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and then Job's closing monologue. That was probably the original text, that they felt that they had to write whole new sections with new answers to the text questions. The cosmic answer from Elihu, from the whirlwind, and of course the prudential answer from the prologue and epilogue. So what was so scary about this text that they felt that they had to rewrite it or add to it to answer it? And the short answer, I think seemingly, is reflective wisdom, the same kind of disturbing text that we have with Ecclesiastes. So the core components of Job offer a lengthy reflection on the problem of evil. Why would someone entirely innocent be punished by God? And it turns out that this text is very similar to a Mesopotamian text called the Babylonian Theodicy, poem written maybe 900 before the Common Era or earlier in Babylon, that consists of 27 dialogues between a righteous sufferer and his friend. And at the end of that whole cycle, the Babylonian Theodicy is a word where you're essentially trying to explain the problem of evil. Why do the righteous suffer? At the end of this dialogue, there is no divine answer. And that is also true, seemingly, in the original book of Job. And indeed, even though we have tacked onto it these cosmic answers, including the amazing answers of God out of the whirlwind, that answer is known to the author of the original text. And in fact, he dismisses that answer. So although, like I say, those answers are added on in new sections, this is articulated by Job as part of the dialogue. So that's a potential answer. So speaking to his friends, Job answered, "Indeed, I know this is so, but how can a mortal be just before God? God shakes the earth out of its place, and its pillars tremble. God commands the sun, and it does not rise. He seals up the stars. He alone stretches out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. God made the Bear and Orion, Ursa Major and Orion, the Pleiades, star cluster, and the chambers of the south, so the constellations. God does great things beyond understanding, marvelous things without number. Look, he passes by me, and I do not see him. He moves on, but I do not perceive him. He snatches away. Who can stop him? Who will say to God, 'What are you doing?'" So you can't question God. God is too cosmic to answer. So Job already knew that was not a sufficient answer, even though it's portrayed as an answer in the add-ons. So in the core text then, Job's 3 friends spend their part of the dialogue making the standard pronouncements of prudential wisdom, that kind of wisdom that we find in the book of Proverbs. For example, at one point, Eliphaz asks, "Think now, who that was innocent ever perished? Or were there the upright cut off, or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity sow trouble and reap the same." So this is exactly the kind of stuff that it says in the book of Proverbs. So if you plow iniquity, you're going to reap the same, and if you're innocent, you're never going to perish, and if you're upright, you're never going to get cut off. I've never seen that happen. Is what he's saying in the same way that the book of Proverbs says that. And so Eliphaz, extrapolating from that same kind of prudential wisdom, says, "Look, Job, since you were suffering, you must have done something wrong," and so on. But by experiencing calamity, having lived a blameless life and having followed all of the precepts of prudential wisdom, Job, here as a thought experiment, poses a powerful challenge to his complacent friends, a challenge that they don't want to accept because they're so steeped in prudential wisdom. And ultimately, Job has uncomfortable conclusions about God, which are, he destroys both the blameless and the wicked. So the rain falls on the just and unjust alike. When disaster brings sudden death, God mocks the calamity of the innocent. The earth is given into the hand of the wicked, and God covers the eyes of its judges. If it's not God who's doing this, then who is it? So this would have been very uncomfortable. You can see why editors are adding things to try to soften this text and its teachings. So Job's very powerful complaint on our behalf, on the behalf of all mortals, is God has denied me, a perfectly innocent man, justice. And so, like Ecclesiastes, the core component of the book of Job offered reflections on the wisdom tradition that these sages had inherited from Proverbs that included very strong challenges to the simple prudential precepts, but they did so without offering up new simplistic answers the way that the tack-on answers in Job offer. Okay, so at this point, as we've been covering both the conflict between all of the early sages and the prophets and the priests, and now we've also seen the ways in which reflective wisdom posed especially challenging questions, we may wonder how these texts made it into the canon at all. Why did anybody put these in the Bible? Why did any priests or prophets anyway allow these into that? Certainly, as always, if a text is quite old and very well known, and it has attribution to somebody as important as King Solomon, that helps. And so that helped Proverbs and Ecclesiastes make their way into the Hebrew Bible. However, the later editions also added some cover. So as we saw with Job, later editors added speeches that seemed to provide answers. So that prologue and epilogue, along with the Elihu speech, the speech out of the whirlwind, that framing changed the stakes of the text and added a so-called happy ending, all of which maybe softened the overall text and made it more acceptable to the canonists who were deciding whether or not to include it with the rest of biblical scripture. And in the same way, an epilogue was tacked on to the end of Ecclesiastes that also maybe made it more palatable, made it softer. So at the very end, after all of these statements that everything is vanity, there's kind of a wrap-up epilogue that reads, "Besides being wise," this is Ecclesiastes, the end of Ecclesiastes, "besides being wise, the teacher also taught the people knowledge. Weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs, the teacher sought to find pleasing words, and he wrote words of truth plainly. The sayings of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings that are given by one shepherd. Of anything beyond these, my child, beware. Of making many books there is no end, and of much study is a weariness of the flesh. The end of the matter all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for that is the whole duty of everyone. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including everything secret, whether good or evil. So this final admonition, which more or less all scholars agree is tacked on by a very different author with a very different theme, may have seemed to soften it and make the whole text palatable enough to include it in the Bible. And indeed, actually, when we had our lecture on Ecclesiastes, and I was highlighting what the actual text is saying, there were some apologetic comments that kind of quote this part of it in order to kind of say, well, no, the final thing at the end of it is, no, just fear God and keep commandments and so on. And that allows people to rehabilitate it for them for the way that they would prefer to think of the text. So again, reacting to the challenges then posed by these reflective sages, the authors of Job and Ecclesiastes, the last two texts that sort of made it halfway into the canon return to prudential wisdom in response and try to rehabilitate the prudential wisdom from Proverbs. So although these two books, Sirach, which is also called Ecclesiasticus, so not to be confused with Ecclesiastes, Sirach, and the Book of Wisdom, which is often called the Wisdom of Solomon, but does not have anything to do with Solomon. Although they were included in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, and are thus part of the biblical canon for the Catholic and Orthodox communities, they're not part of the later rabbinic collection, the Hebrew Bible, nor are they part of the Protestant Old Testament. They're part of the Apocrypha for Protestants. So that's why I say they made it halfway into the canon. So let's look at Sirach. So composed by the Jewish Egyptian sage Jesus ben Sirach around the year 180 before the Common Era. Sirach deliberately imitates the book of Proverbs. So he goes back to having these same kinds of proverbs as he attempts to refocus the tradition on prudential wisdom. So just as the divine embodiment of holy wisdom, we read way back when, speaks to her children in Proverbs chapter 8, so Sirach begins with a poem in praise of holy wisdom, an embodied divine force. So wisdom, he says, was created before all things, and prudent understanding from eternity. The root of wisdom, to whom has it been revealed, her subtleties, who knows them? There is but one who is truly wise, greatly to be feared, seated upon his throne, the Lord. It is he who created her, he saw her and he took her measure. He poured her out upon all his works and upon all living things according to his gift, all the living according to his gift. He lavished her upon those who love him. So wisdom is still central, and it comes from the Lord. So in contrast to the reflective author at the core of Job, who insists that God destroys both the blameless and the wicked, Sirach sees such suffering by the blameless as a test, much like the author of the prologue and the epilogue of the book of Job. So in contrast to Job, Sirach advises, he's talking to his child, "My child, when you come to serve the Lord, prepare yourself for testing. Set your heart right and be steadfast, and don't be impetuous in the time of calamity. Cling to him and do not depart, so that your last days may be prosperous. Accept whatever befalls you, and in times of humiliation be patient. For gold is tested in the fire, and those found acceptable in humiliation's furnace." So life is a test. You may be tested. You should be prepared to be tested. Gold is tested in the fire, and so are the the righteous. Turn in him, and he will help you. Make your way straight and hope in him. You who fear the Lord, wait for his mercy. Do not stray, or else you may fall. You who fear the Lord, trust in him, and your reward will not be lost. You who fear the Lord, hope for good things, for lasting joy and mercy. Consider the generations of old and see, has anyone trusted in the Lord and been disappointed? So, Sirach here is denying the thought experiment. So Job's apparent plight, in other words, that there is an idea where a perfectly innocent person is not, is made to suffer. Has anyone had faith in the Lord and been disappointed? No. So Sirach is asking us here to believe that all the faithful are rewarded. And this reward is not in the afterlife. There is no afterlife as far as Sirach is concerned. So ideas about afterlife were only beginning to make their way into the various traditions of Second Temple Judaism. And so already in the first century of the Common Era, as opposed to here the second century before the Common Era, not all of the sects of Second Temple Judaism had come to believe in an afterlife. But the idea of afterlife is unknown to Proverbs and also Job. And as we saw, it's denied by the very skeptical teacher in Ecclesiastes. And Sirach here likewise denies that humans have any kind of meaningful afterlife. So we read, who will sing praises to the Most High in Hades, in the place of the living who give thanks? From the dead, as from one who does not exist, thanksgiving has ceased. Those who are alive and well sing the Lord's praises, for not everything is within human capacity, since human beings are not immortal. Instead, Sirach insists that God will always reward the righteous in the end of this life, but sometimes that may be at the very end of life itself. So he says, it's easy for the Lord on the day of death to reward individuals according to their conduct. So you might have been suffering your whole life long, and then suddenly he can reward you right there at the end before you die. An hour's misery makes one forget delights, and at the close of one's life, one's deeds are revealed. Nevertheless, this sort of idea that despite all of your suffering throughout life, like Job was having, you might suddenly get, let's say, 7 new kids or something like that, or maybe just a very happy moment right before your death, that wasn't a sufficient answer for many, and it's already wearing thin by the time Sirach is writing among Second Temple Judaism. And so by the time we get to the next book, the Book of Wisdom, they have fully embraced afterlife reward and punishment, and that becomes a new answer to the problem of evil. So the Book of Wisdom is written some 2 centuries after Sirach, again by a Jewish sage in Egypt, in Roman Alexandria, probably somewhere between 30 before the Common Era and 40 of the Common Era. So the Book of Wisdom, sometimes called the Wisdom of Solomon, has definitely embraced the idea of afterlife and uses eternal reward and punishment as an answer to the problem of evil. So in the Book of Wisdom we read, the souls of the righteous are in the hands of God, and no torment will ever touch them. In the eyes of the foolish, they seemed to have died, and their departure was thought to be a disaster, and their going from us to be their destruction. But they are at peace. For, though in the sight of others they were punished, their hope is full of immortality. It's almost Docetus. In other words, they seemed to die. They seem to have been punished in this life, but actually they're immortal and their souls are with God, and they're not. So having been disciplined a little in this life, they will receive great good, because God tested them and found them worthy of himself. Like gold in the furnace, he tried them, and like a sacrificial burnt offering, he accepted them. So in this future eternity, they will govern nations and rule over peoples, and the Lord will reign over them forever. And those who trust in him will understand truth, and the faithful will abide with him in love, because grace and mercy are upon his holy ones, and he watches over his elect. So, in contrast to that eternal reward that is prepared for the wise and the righteous, who only now seem to be punished or not really punished, on the other side, the flip side of this coin, the ungodly are going to face a very real punishment in the afterlife. The ungodly will be punished as their reasoning deserves. Those who disregarded the righteous and rebelled against the Lord, for those who despise wisdom and instruction are miserable. Their hope is vain, their labors are unprofitable, their works are useless. Their wives are foolish, their children are evil, their offspring are accursed. So that's going to be, you got it all bad. The Book of Wisdom is also very contemptuous of Ecclesiastes, the teacher's skepticism and reflective insights, and calls them unsound reasoning, and sort of has a kind of a whole mocking section where he kind of reframes the kind of insights of Ecclesiastes. So the author of the Book of Wisdom says, for these people, like the author of Ecclesiastes, reasoned unsoundly, saying to themselves, short and sorrowful is our life, and there's no remedy when a life comes to its end, and no one has been known to return from Hades, for we were born by mere chance, and hereafter we shall be as though we had never been. For the breath in our nostrils is smoke, and reason is a spark kindled by the beating of our hearts, and when it's extinguished, the body will turn to ashes, and the spirit will dissolve like empty air. So people who believe this, like the teacher in Ecclesiastes, according to the Book of Wisdom, draw a false conclusion. So they say, come, therefore, let us enjoy the good things that exist, and make use of the creation to the full, as in youth. Let us take our fill of costly wines and perfumes, and let no flower of spring pass us by. Let us crown ourselves with rosebuds before they wither. Let no meadow be free from our revelry. Everywhere let us leave signs of enjoyment, because this is our portion, this is our lot. And so, so I have Ecclesiastes talking about what our lot is, and yet we know already that this is a caricature, because this is already leading to extreme hedonism, which Ecclesiastes is not in favor of. Nevertheless, according to the Book of Wisdom, this kind of reasoning is false and ultimately leads to every kind of wickedness. So following the religious tradition that we've now done, I appreciate you sticking with me. This has been going on for a little while. Following the wisdom tradition down to Sirach and the Book of Wisdom, brings us into the immediate context of Jesus. The Book of Wisdom is potentially written in his lifetime, who himself participated in the wisdom tradition. In our lecture on Q, we saw the Sayings Gospel Q's portrayal of Jesus as participating in the wisdom tradition. And indeed, his teachings, especially in sayings like the Q sayings, seem to be interacting with and reacting against this return to prudential wisdom as expressed in Sirach. I'm not going to go through all of the details of that, because our focus here is on the Old Testament, but just to show that this we're getting to the place where this is the immediate context of Jesus. And so, as we've seen, the sages here are not simply participating in a tradition that sets them squarely against prophets and priests, but they themselves are frequently in conflict with each other. We can also say in constructive dialogue with each other, but sometimes it's antagonistic and mocking, as we saw with the Book of Wisdom's take on Ecclesiastes. Just as priests and prophets also argued among themselves. And thus, that allows us to see that the whole biblical tradition is a rich tapestry that doesn't just speak with one voice that is totally non-contradictory, but rather has multiple perspectives that frankly invite us into dialogue and allow us to decide, not that there's any one teaching, but rather there are different ideas, and some of these may have more or less meaning to us individually if we are worried or care about those things. And so that is my vision that I wanted to show of the wisdom tradition and my explanation of sages against prophets and priests. I will go ahead and get some water, and Mike will maybe tell me your questions and comments, and we can have our dialogue. Okay, so I'm going to begin by thanking people who've been giving support. So I want to thank JM, I want to thank my Lord, Mark Long, Dartha Rama, Kevin Thompson, Tim DeMoss, and Mike R. Thanks all of you for supporting this channel and allowing us to spend time researching and creating these lectures. So Ron Wagner says, so Proverbs is like Poor Richard's Almanac. Yes, so it's like a big collection of a bunch of stuff, and some of it is, you have to kind of go through and find something that is going to be useful to you, but it's not necessarily all going to be useful to you. But yes, I'd say yes. MY says, does Jesus quote any of the wisdom books, and or do any of the epistle writers quote any of the Old Testament wisdom books when they're teaching Christians how to behave? Yes. So I think that there are some quotations in the New Testament, but I would have to look those up. So in terms of Jesus, there's not a direct quotation, but there are sayings that are found in the wisdom tradition, including, for example, lots of sayings that are similar to sayings from Sirach, and Jesus may be playing off of these, so those are in the background. And when he is presenting his own kind of upside down from prudential wisdom sayings, when is telling people to lend to people who you can't expect to pay you back, that kind of thing is the opposite of prudential wisdom that you find in Proverbs and Sirach. So he does seem to be engaging with the tradition, although there's no, I don't think there's any direct literary dependence, as opposed to when he will say things like, you have heard it said, and he'll quote Torah and say, but I say the opposite, where he overturns Torah and overturns the different law. But I don't know offhand. Like I said, I didn't do the Jesus section of it. That's just my shorthand of it. Mike R., you stated that biblical mass production and layman readings contributed to fundamental misinterpretation. Could widespread textual criticism lead to a shift in Christian thought? So I said this in an earlier lecture. I said, when people have asked in the question before, why is this misinterpretation of the Bible so common among Christians in modern times, especially sort of now, but especially in the last couple centuries? And I was saying that part of the, as Mike is saying, part of the answer may be that suddenly literacy became widespread with the introduction of the printing press. People actually had direct access to the book. So people who did not have any formal education, but who could read now, were able to read the stories without having any kind of training to understand what this book, which had been now brought into their personal vernacular language, the language that they spoke, didn't have the ability to understand it for the very ancient text it was, and for all of the alien insights and everything else that it had. And so that contributed, like I say, to a fundamentalist misinterpretation. could widespread textual criticism lead to a shift in Christian thought? It can and does when it happens. And so I'll just say that my particular denomination, Community of Christ, just has a huge focus on graduate education, and the number of people who go back to the seminary and learn this do this kind of study is significant. And so that has massively changed how we understand Scripture. And so it definitely affects. It certainly, the study of this affected all of my thought, and I think that it definitely affects everybody who does, but it would just have to be much more widespread indeed. That's certainly our goal, one of our goals and objectives in this channel. John Williams says, is there anything Hellenistic about these parables? So probably I think you mean Proverbs. And so the Proverbs are, some of them are, so the Proverbs are a collection, some of which go very much back, and some of them are maybe composed in the end of the First Temple period, and some of them are composed after in the exile and into the Second Temple period. And so they would have, there are some components of these that show the Persian influence, and some of it is composed late, and so people have argued in some cases for the latest sections of Proverbs maybe have some Hellenistic signs to them, but one of the issues about the presence of Greek ideas is that Greek ideas spread before the Hellenistic era. They became much more widespread when Alexander conquered everything and Hellenistic kings started imposing Hellenistic ideas when Alexandria was founded and so on. But that's why it's harder to argue whether or not, let's say, Proverbs made it into its final form in the Persian period or early into the Hellenistic period. There's nothing too Hellenistic about the Proverbs in Proverbs. Some of the people have argued that some of the reflective wisdom in Job and Ecclesiastes may show more Hellenistic ideas, although the dating of those is not fixed, and so it's in that kind of same time period, the early, very late Persian period, early Hellenistic period. Then once we get to the last two on there, the book of Sirach and the book of Wisdom, those now have a lot of Hellenistic influence. These are written in Hellenistic Egypt. So, Kelly Higgins, is the refrain "under the sun" more than a rhetorical device in the book of Ecclesiastes, where the author, the teacher, is constantly talking about vanity under the sun? So the idea there is the separation between the mortal realm and the eternal realm, the celestial realm. And so it's a poetic way of marking the division between that which is eternal, the divine, and then that which is mortal and perishable, everything that's under the sun. Mike R. says, in Ecclesiastes, is vanity better translated as fleeting? Yeah, it could be. That's a good way to do it. So everything is fleeting, like you say. It's ephemeral. It won't last. And so that's, like I say, the perishable world that's under the sun, as opposed to the eternal world that endures above the sun. And we say vanity because that's the word that I think goes all the way back to the King James, and so and that's why vanity has its some of its quotable, I think some of the phrases like bonfire of the vanities and all these kinds of things, because vanity became such a associated with that. But it's the sense that everything is done in vain. So now vanity has become so much more associated with you thinking about your good looks or something like that, as opposed to just being pointless, which was the original idea. It's probably the word doesn't have the same meaning in colloquial English as it had when it was first translated that way with King James. Scott Worthen says, nothing new under the sun kind of flies in the face of humanity's ability to innovate, am I missing something here? So Scott, you're not. You're just in a different place in history than antiquity. So in antiquity, the general belief was that everything had happened before, and indeed that civilization, humanity, everything like that was actually in a major decline. That there had been a golden age, and where everything was better, and now at best all we're doing is kind of reliving things that had been before, and everything is gloomier and darker. And so we went from a golden age to a silver age to a bronze age to an iron age and an age of clay. And that was very common, the golden age myth and golden age perception. And that only flipped in modern times with the idea of modernity, which gives us the conception of progress. And so with technological innovation and a lot of the other revolutions of modernity, the Industrial Revolution, and so on, people started envisioning the future as being better, which is itself a change in that kind of perception. And so we're now at the other side of the modern era. We're into the postmodern era when people have been very gloomy about the future again. But in the meanwhile, we now have, like you say, a sense that lots of innovation actually does happen. That wouldn't have been as true. The kinds of change that we've seen in our lifetimes would not be apparent. Certainly not that level of technological innovation would not have been apparent at almost any time in any generation in antiquity when everything was moving much more slowly. Thank you, David Anderson, for your support of the channel. Prashant Sharma asks, are there Christian traditions where the wisdom books are given as prominent a place as, say, the Gospels? I feel that they are neglected in many denominations. So I think there is not. I don't think that there's a Christian tradition where, certainly not as the Gospels. I think that in the past, Christians were likely to quote Proverbs, and so therefore they're using, like, let's say the least useful of the of the kind of the wisdom tradition. But on the other hand, the book of Job, I think, has always continued to be one of the most popular and thought-provoking texts of the Old Testament, and so that, I think, is not neglected among the Old Testament texts. And lots of people like Ecclesiastes, but I don't know that it's not necessarily a focus in a lot of Christian denominations that I'm aware of. Dallas Ken says, in the future, do you plan to have a lecture on the book of Esther as allegory and narrative? Yes, I definitely will also do Esther. It's an interesting, very interesting book, and so we definitely need to have a lecture on that. TTYL says, did the sages exist in the time of Canaanite polytheism? And does the later rabbinic tradition have a lot of continuity with the sage wisdom tradition from Israelite philosophical culture? So the answer is yes. So Canaanite polytheism existed all the way down to the end of the Second Temple period, and actually all the way into the First Temple period and into the Second Temple period. And so there are sages around at that time, so there's overlap for sure. And in terms of continuity with wisdom traditions, there certainly is. So the wisdom traditions that were already absorbed into that get absorbed into the Hebrew Bible, though there's continuity with those. I think one of the little bit of discontinuities here, and one of the reasons why the last two of these books, like I say, didn't make its way into Rabbinic Judaism, is that when sort of Greek Israelite religion really spins off into Christianity, and Christians really kind of pull from the Hellenistic Jewish traditions as they convert all these Greek speakers into their new religion. There's a little bit of a reaction from the rabbis of not wanting to focus on some of the stuff that's been coming out of Alexandria. And so these later books, the Septuagint, that are in the Septuagint, including the Book of Wisdom, including Sirach, don't make it into the canon. And people like, and Jewish writers writing in Greek, like Philo of Alexandria, are also remembered by the Christians, but are not preserved within the Jewish tradition. And so the rabbis certainly have preserved a focus on wisdom, but theirs is a scribal tradition that is rooted in Torah. So it's definitely rooted in law. So these are the the scribes that are hanging around, scribes and teachers that are hanging around the priests, and who are definitely have absorbed Torah as the most important thing, which wouldn't have been true for the early parts of this wisdom tradition, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, but had become true for the later part of it, when everybody has started to. We had a whole lecture recently about Torah becoming central and authoritative within Second Temple Judaism in the Maccabee period and a little after. So thank you, Julia, for your contribution. JB says, do we know enough about Egyptian religious beliefs and their wisdom tradition to identify where these ideas are represented in the Bible and when they may have been introduced? So Egyptian religious beliefs, I'm trying to think about what the effect of any Egyptian religious belief. So we have this example in Proverbs of an Egyptian wisdom text that is reworked and becomes part of Proverbs. But in terms of, general worship and all of the ways that the Egyptians understood afterlife, those don't seem to have had a lot of effect on Second Temple Judaism. There's maybe by the time you're getting to the first century in Christianity, there's a possibility that Lazarus and the raising of Lazarus has Egyptian story roots to it. But in general, I would say most of the dominant ideas that are really getting pulled in are coming from the Persian side, Zoroastrian side, and then on the Egyptian side, the Egyptians are dealing with the fact that they've been conquered by the Greeks, and so the Hellenism. And so it's less about the traditional religion of Egypt, I think, that is affecting the Bible, and we don't certainly have as many signs of it. This was one standout that we have here in the book of Proverbs. Julie Bazuski asks, since there are no satisfying answers to the problem of evil on earth, I can see why the apocalyptic answer was so alluring and is still to so many. Can John comment? Absolutely. That is a simple answer that is very alluring. So you can't find the answer by looking around on earth, and so then you say, well, but don't worry, if you're not, the whole world is going to end, and when that happens, everybody who's been unjust was going to face horrible torment. Everybody who was just is going to be the elect and is going to get whisked off the earth, and there'll be a punishment, a new world that is eternal, that doesn't have any of those inequities. So yes, that's clearly considering the failures of the other kind of answers, which are sort of like cosmic answer, don't think about it, or it's not maybe a failure, but it's not satisfying, or the sort of answer that God actually is kind of at the last second, the Prudential answer, there is some kind of a recompense that is happening. It always more or less is happening, which doesn't seem to be the case. And so instead, there is this reflective exploration that defies a simple answer that I think is where is less popular, because a simple answer is popular, but nevertheless is perhaps the only response that doesn't trivialize the suffering. So if you look at horrific human suffering and say, oh well, it's all right because it's only a test, that's a simple answer, and maybe so, whatever, but that doesn't seem very satisfying any more than everything's going to be made right in an afterlife. And so these sophisticated texts that explore the problems and consider that as part of being human, and having us understand that and be able to react to that and live with that is a rich part of the tradition, even if it's, let's say, not as immediately alluring and the kind of thing that you can easily sell somebody on. Seeking something. With the book of Job and the story of Faust, is it likely that these are drawing from an even older story group? What is the Community of Christ opinion on drawing from stories outside the canon? So yeah, in terms of, I think maybe you're like the wager, and in Job, this is probably, yes, is not going to be original to that author who is tacking on a prologue and an epilogue, but it is a way to frame this kind of a thought experiment that is an interesting literary device that probably has a lot deeper roots. In terms of Community of Christ, in my opinion, in terms of drawing on stories outside the canon, our unofficial motto from the beginning has always been truth wherever it is found. And so we look to find truth wherever you find truth. And we very much in my congregation will quote from all kinds of sources, including people have brought prayers from the Buddhist tradition. People have expressed wisdom from the Taoist tradition. I tend to think of, I'm always amazed by the sophistication at the very beginning of human civilization of some of the wisdom that's found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and don't mind telling that story or quoting from that in a service. So yeah, we can definitely draw from these rich traditions that are outside of the Christian canon. Seeking something. What is one to do with these teachings now in the Community of Christ's opinion? What is the most day-to-day usage that we can have from these texts? So, in terms of the wisdom tradition, I think that you can probably tell I'm sort of a partisan for the reflective wisdom as opposed to the prudential wisdom. I think that there's a place for prudential wisdom. I think that, in fact, a lot of these, these maxims about acting prudently, doing wise things, are going to get you pretty far, but they don't get they work while they work, and so doing things in moderation, all of those kinds of wise things. But if you are counting on them, that if you do X, Y, and Z, you're definitely going to have a successful result. You're going to have unexpected suffering in life, and so that will only get you so far. And that's where the reflective wisdom that's found in Ecclesiastes and Job can be very helpful. And so I think that what these do is, just like the dialogues of Plato, they're not giving you an answer, they're pulling you into the dialogue and having you think. And so that would be a very positive day-to-day use that we can have in my church anyway, from these texts. And we probably, so right now we do cycles in my congregation where we kind of focus on different scriptures throughout the course of the year on a Sunday. And so last year we did the Gospel of Luke, and this year we're doing Matthew. We might be having an Old Testament one soon, in which case we would be drawing from these texts in Sunday for doing kind of a deep dive and thinking about these and what they would mean in our lives today. Seeking Something says, why do you think most other denominations don't have the same opinion as Community of Christ as far as drawing from outside doctrines? I imagine Community of Christ doesn't have a statement of faith, right? So we're not creedal, so we don't have a creed where we say, I believe in one God and so on, the credo. But we do have statements. We do have statements of basic beliefs. So we say how different things that we uphold. We definitely, for example, uphold enduring principles that endure. Things like responsible choices, worth of all persons, unity and diversity, and so on. So we do have a lot of things that are kind of built on, but they're not tests of faith. So you don't have to constantly uphold each one of these if you really have some kind of an opposition to one of the points that's as part of it. In terms of why other denominations are just content, let's say other Christians maybe would not want to bring in non-canonized texts. Well, they don't have the motto that we have, truth wherever you find it. There is always a sense when you have a group of having group cohesion and identity. So if you have a big solid boundary and you say this is ours and this is our canon and everything outside of it isn't us, that's a way that you make group cohesion. There's all kinds of reasons for doing that. I guess one of the reasons is that we're a relatively younger tradition, so our church is only 200 years old, and so we maybe are more open to different things than a tradition like the Greek Orthodox Church, where they've been kind of doing the same thing in the same way for not quite 2,000 years, at least 1,000 without a lot of changes. I mean, there's been changes, but anyway, in other words, there's a lot of continuity for them, whereas we try to draw, I think, on the whole tradition, and then we also understand that before the beginnings of the multiple Christianities, we also have as precursors to Christianities both the entire Second Temple and First Temple Israelite traditions, but also that Christianity also was significantly influenced by everything from certainly Greek philosophy to Zoroastrianism and so forth. And so why not draw on all of these traditions that are part of our context, is my view. Ron Wagner says, is there a reason why the books of Sirach and the Wisdom of Solomon were not included in the Rabbinic and the Protestant Bibles? So they're not included in the Rabbinic Bibles because the rabbis did not go back to the Septuagint. So they're not focused on what the Greek Bible was. And so those are part of the Greek Bible, which had become the Christian Old Testament. And instead, they drew from the Hebrew texts and decided which ones that they felt were appropriate to Rabbinic Judaism. So they created the canon, kind of around the same time the Christians were creating their canon. And so why don't the Protestants have it? The Protestants don't have it is because when they were breaking away from the Catholics, or were separating from the Catholics, they wanted to translate. They didn't want to use Latin anymore for their Bible, and they wanted to translate directly from Hebrew into their own vernacular languages, into German and into English and so forth. And so they visited the local Jews, and they found out, wait a second, the Jews don't have, in modern Europe here, don't have all of the same books that we have in our Latin Bibles. And so ultimately the Protestants kick out all of the books that have been in the Septuagint, but were not in the later rabbinic canon, and so that's why the Jews and the Protestants have the same, and the Orthodox and the Catholics have a different version. Taboo Cat says, is the wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible more influenced by Babylonian or Egyptian wisdom literature? Is it an amalgamation of the two, or something local or different entirely? So I'm just going to say, in general, Taboo Cat, I haven't studied enough of the Babylonian and Egyptian wisdom literature to know, but I would suggest that my sense is that there's a bunch of Egyptian in there, as we know, as I mentioned, but then the Babylonian is probably a bigger influence. It's an amalgamation of the two, though, in the sense that this wisdom literature was able to travel, cosmopolitanly. So it was able to be spread. The Egyptian stuff could be spread else to Mesopotamia and vice versa. And so it's participating in a bigger tradition. So I wouldn't say it's local and different entirely, but it has its own local variation, of course. Ham and Chi says, in a modern parallel, are prophets liberals and priests conservatives? If so, what are sages? So it could be. So, or rather, we might say priests are maintainers of institutions and tradition. Lots of modern conservatives now are reactionary revolutionaries who are trying to burn everything down, and so those would not be the same as priests. So it depends on what you mean by conservative, but an old definition of conservative, priests are that. And in terms of prophets, we might say they are the sort of progressive revolutionaries who are trying to overturn unjust systems, and so maybe that. In terms of sages, what would the sages be? I guess that would then be moderates, so people who are asking for moderation in all things, as being kind of prudential and wise. If you are not, they're talking to. There's simple steps for living a good life, kind of thing, and you don't have to be overly in any one camp or the other. So maybe that would work. Okay. Seeking something. I am very fascinated by the way Dionysius and Jesus seem to act very similarly. I would argue that he also acts like several other characters in the Greek world mythos. Are there any opinions about these similarities? So there was an entire early modern era, or 19th century fad that was attempting to see parallels between so-called dying and raising gods. And that was a very popular idea in the 19th century that was kind of equating, like you're talking about Dionysius or Adonis or the Egyptian one. I'm trying to think. Anyway, in other words, these gods that are killed and then are resurrected again, and to then see Jesus in that same family, and that those parallels, drawing on those kind of parallelisms, those were seen as being majorly interrelated. But that has more or less totally unraveled, and so that isn't part of academia anymore. But people note similarities between different myths. So, and there are similar universals and archetypes. Humans worry about, death in a literal sense, but then they also worry about it, in the metaphorical sense of, let's say, over time, is the small town that you lived in, the small town way of life, is that dying? And how can that be resurrected? So those kinds of broader archetypical, metaphorical ways. And so in that sense, these mythic archetypes are part of that. And there's the resurrection part of Jesus, sort of plays into, or is derived from this sort of afterlife concerns and ideas, but also kind of renewal of the world and that kind of thing are part of those archetypical ideas. Dartharama says, do you think John could do a lecture on the difference between Jewish and Christian interpretations of the Hebrew Bible / Old Testament? I don't know if I think I could. So the problem with it is that I would have to do a lot of study about how. There's so many different kinds of Judaism, right? And so here's what I do know. So when I go to I'm part of a interfaith bunch of interfaith groups where I get together with other leaders of other religious traditions, and so that also includes rabbis, and we sometimes go and have a Sabbath service at Holy Blossom Synagogue, for example, which is one of the most important Reform synagogues in the world here in Toronto. And so sometimes when I've done that, I've tried to kind of engage with members there about what is the kind of scholarly lens that they look through, and so they have a bunch of advantages over the average Christian, in that there is a big focus on learning the original language, and so lots of them have all gone to Hebrew school and have learned Hebrew, and there is a lot of use of Hebrew in the worship itself. Excuse me. And so they're more familiar with the original text by a lot, and that gives you all kinds of insights, for example, into the puns and other things that are going on. That said, just with the examples that I've had, I don't know that this would come through to the rabbis, which I haven't had a long conversations with, but all of the people that I've talked to there are very unaware of, in their study of just kind of basic things like, well, what about Torah authorship? Is there, are they kind of looking at it through the lens of, the multiple different source texts, documentary hypothesis, or a hypothesis of accumulation hypothesis? How are they looking at that? And the guy was kind of looking at me like, what are you talking about? We don't, they don't focus on those kinds of things. And so certainly they're not approaching it the way we do here, but we're really weird among Christians anyway. So it's hard to, compare exactly what would happen. So it'd be a little more complicated to do, but it's an interesting task to think about. Okay, the final question from my lord. John, I am puzzled by your theology, but I enjoy your lectures. Well, enjoy lectures is the most important thing from my perspective right now. So part of my philosophy is that church should be interesting. So learning should be enjoyable. I was continually amazed in graduate school by fellow grad students who felt that history, I presume that they felt that writing history was meant to be boring because the way they wrote history was boring, And for me, history should always be interesting and engaging. All of this is so interesting. And so I'm pleased that you find the lectures enjoyable, and my theology is puzzling, which is fine. Part of the whole idea of it is entering into dialogue and being part of the dialogue and the puzzle, just like with the reflective wisdom. So thank you all so much. Don't forget to like and share the video, subscribe to the channel. We appreciate all of the support that we've already had. You can also make a donation again here or at the website, centerplace.ca/donate. And next week, we are going to talk about, we just had said what I said what it was going to be. Oh, iconoclasm. That's going to be an exciting one. So thank you again. Good night.